Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of my past weekend in reading. If you follow me on Goodreads, you know I very rarely give anything 5 stars, but the first and last things that I read this weekend I did give 5 stars to, which is unusual for me. So, the first thing that I read this weekend, which ended up really surprising me, is The Wildstorm. This is volume 1 of the relaunch of the Wildstorm universe, which is a comic book setting that was created by Jim Lee 25 years ago. It was originally an imprint at Image Comics. It later went to DC. A lot of the corporate-owned characters were brought over into the DC universe with the New 52, and this breaks them out into their own story again. This is written by Warren Ellis and drawn by John Davis Hunt. Warren Ellis, of course, wrote quite a few Wildstorm books. In the late 90s, he was writing Stormwatch and then The Authority and Planetary. I think his book Red was also originally a Wildstorm book. In any case, this is a book I had been considering picking up in the individual issues, and I almost pre-ordered the physical trade of this, but I was really on the fence about it. I was quite a fan of the Wildstorm universe in the 90s. I always have this Midnighter figure here, but I have Grifter here because I was doing this review. I don't usually hold this up, but I do drink my coffee out of a Wildcats mug every day. So I was concerned that I wasn't going to enjoy this, but I didn't need to be concerned because this ended up being brilliant. It takes a much more modern art style. It is very stripped down. This is not the bright colors and big muscle of the 1990s books. It's much more subdued, and in the notes at the end, it's clear that that was something that they were doing intentionally, to rebrand this in a distinct and different way. It uses a lot of characters that we know. If you're familiar with Wildcats and The Authority and N13 and all of that, you will recognize a bunch of them. Grifter is in it, Zealot, Voodoo, piles of people. But it is not just this crossover event where you're seeing all your favorite characters again. It sets up a universe with a political system, with a set of action pieces, with enough soap opera-y elements, which really any good superhero comic needs, because that links the action pieces together. And it all played out really nicely in a really perfect way, I would almost say. I was extremely concerned that this was not going to live up to the promise, but it exceeded my expectations in almost every way. I really was entertained by it. And continuing on a theme, another book that I picked up at the same time was Wildstorm, A Celebration of 25 Years, which for the 25th anniversary of the launch of the Wildstorm imprint, this book was put together. It has a few original stories, a few reprints, a few covers and posters that were never actually published. This reprints the first issue of Wildcats in black and white, which I think takes away from some of the kind of mid-90s over-the-topness that it would normally have. But there's a bit of kind of joking of bringing the very 90s-ish characters into the modern day in a more humorous style. There are some stories that were made just for this collection. There's an Authority short story that is written by Warren Ellis and drawn by Brian Hitch, who of course did the first 12-issue run on The Authority. It also has the black and white reprints of 2 of Mark Millar's issues on The Authority, which when it went into coloring, they colored them to blur the level of violence that some of these had, so they're reprinted so you can see that. There are some, as I said, alternate covers. There's a script proposal that Grant Morrison did for a series proposal for a Wildcats book that never came out. There are some mock-ups for the, this was the new 52 Stormwatch. It was a fun book. That is not one that I would recommend to people who are not pre-existing fans of the Wildstorm universe. I think if you are not a person who has a bunch of these figures on your shelves and who's, you know, drinking your coffee out of this mug, maybe not your thing. I think if you were reading a lot of Wildstorm titles in the 90s, definitely pick that up because it is fun. Next up, I attempted to work my way through some more of The Right Way to Be Crippled and Naked, which is a short story collection by a variety of different authors centering around themes of disability and paired with essays or sometimes just paragraphs from the authors about their writing decisions. I had been finding this quite interesting, but for some reason it stopped loading on me. And as it turned out, it wasn't a Hoopla issue, because I'm reading this through Hoopla. It was an issue specific to the book, so I've logged a trouble ticket with the library, so we'll see if I ever get to finish that. I was disappointed, but hey, what are you gonna do? The audiobook that I was listening to this weekend was Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's We Should All Be Feminists, which is super short. It's 40 minutes long. I've seen a lot of people hold this up, and it's a tiny little bind-up of an essay. It's very Feminism 101, which is a little more simplistic than I had expected it to be. It is fine, and she narrates it herself, which is done nicely. I don't have a lot to say about it because it is very 101. And then finally, I read Golden Hill by Frances Spufford. Jess from Garden Scriptorium talked about this months ago, and based on what she said, I was definitely curious to pick this up. And then I saw Mel from Mel's Bookland Adventures also talked about this quite a bit, and I felt some real hype. I was enthusiastic to pick this up. And then I got a little more cautious because I saw both Cheryl from CR Flames Fan and Candace from Beacon Hill Books also read this and didn't enjoy it nearly as much. So I was curious to see where I was going to fall on this, and reading this ended up being a funny experience. It was highs and lows. This book tells the story of a young man from England who arrives in New York City in the 1740s. He has a banknote for £1,000, and he's going to have drama trying to cash it because that is a lot of money in those days. I don't know what I expected going into this, considering that I had watched so many people do reviews of this, but it was a real adventure almost reading this, because initially I was reading it and I thought this is a very dry historical novel. And then it started dropping in kind of references, which are references that someone in the 1740s would have been able to make, but if you actually read historical documents, there are so many references that we don't get anymore because the cultural touchstones have shifted. So it was striking me as more and more convenient that all of the references they were making were things that, yes, historically acceptable, but things that we get, which struck me as very kind of Shakespeare in Love-ish, which I think is fine in moderation, but when you get a whole book of that, I would start to get irritated. And just when I got to a point where I thought, okay, this is going to be the whole book, this will be annoying, it stopped. And the writing style completely changed, and we get another section that is written in the first person, and it's the main character writing a letter to his father. And that's written in a super stylized way. It is not exactly the way someone would be writing in the mid-1700s, but it is definitely reflective of that. A lot of random capitalizations and apostrophes and so on, which, if you are someone who reads words as units or phrases as units, it makes it you really have to slow down as you read that. And it was physically interesting because up until that point I'd been reading it in a normal way, and to be forced to slow down like that made me pay attention to it differently, which both irritated me in part because I don't like being slowed down, but at the same time it made me listen to the rhythm of that language a little bit differently. So that was interesting. And then that section ended, and we get to another section, which is written in the similar style to the first, but there seem to be fewer references. There is a play within a play, and at one point there is a description of how the audience is reacting to a character, and then shortly afterwards, when we exit that section, two things happen, one of which is a love affair and then a duel, and they're described in such a way that I ended up reacting in a way that I think is similar to the way they were describing the audience reacting to the play. And I thought that was hilarious because it was one of those things where I feel like I'm being manipulated, but it's such successful manipulation that I loved it, and I thought it was ridiculous. And then the duel ended in a way that both horrified me, and I thought that's unsatisfying, but I had such a strong reaction that I couldn't help but respect the fact that I was having that strong of a reaction. And then the story continued, and it continued to thwart my expectations. I think every time I thought I knew where this book was going, stylistically or story-wise, it did something different, and I loved that. I thought this was a great experience reading, even though there were a number of points where I was frustrated or where I started getting annoyed, and then I felt like at every turn it was like, no, that's not what you're getting. Yeah, that just blew me away. I love that. I thought it was such fun, even when I was absolutely horrified by some of the things that were happening, which is a weird feeling, but yeah, I was so impressed with that feeling being clearly created intentionally. So, yeah, super impressed with that. And yeah, that was my weekend. I obviously took a break from reading all of the nonfiction about human brains. I hope you had a great weekend. Let me wish a happy Thanksgiving to the Americans. And that's it for now. Ciao.